pools are breeding grounds for unsavory elements. They attract teenagers. Teenagers who, I might add, have been observed consuming carbonated beverages within a 5-mile radius of my property. The horror in her voice was almost comical. Almost. Therefore, she announced, delivering the final blow with the cold precision of a guillotine, effective immediately, all private swimming pools within Sunridge Estates are to be banned, removed, or filled in. The room erupted like a volcano of repressed suburban rage. Mr. Henderson, normally a mild-mannered accountant, looked like he was about to spontaneously combust, his face turning a shade of purple I didn't know was humanly possible. Mrs. Gable, despite her Chihuahua concerns, shrieked in protest. A chorus of, "What?" and "You can't do that," filled the air. The late afternoon sun dappled through the leaves of the oak tree, casting shimmering patterns on the turquoise water of my pool. A perfect, juicy burger sizzled on the grill, its smoky aroma mingling with the sweet scent of freshly cut grass. I took a long pull of my ice-cold beer, the condensation cool against my hand. Ah, the sweet life, I thought. Nothing beats a Saturday afternoon in my own little slice of suburban paradise. This pool? Best investment I ever made. Keeps the kids entertained, keeps me sane. A gentle splash echoed as my youngest, Timmy, cannonballed into the water, sending a spray of chlorinated bliss my way. Of course, there's always the HOA lurking in the background, ready to measure my grass blades with a micrometer, but so far they haven't messed with my aquatic sanctuary. They'd sent a passive-aggressive note about my flamingo garden gnome last month, excessively whimsical, they'd called it. But the pool was sacred, or so I thought. Little did I know Margaret St. Clair was about to declare war on my happiness. The Sunridge Estates Community Center room was a masterpiece of beige blandness. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on rows of uncomfortable folding chairs. The air hung thick with the aroma of stale coffee and barely concealed resentment, the signature scent of a homeowners association meeting. A palpable tension vibrated through the room, thicker than the cheap, industrial-grade carpet under our feet. And then she entered. Margaret St. Clair. A retired librarian with the steely gaze of a velociraptor and a clipboard that seemed permanently fused to her hand. She ruled Sunridge Estates with an iron fist and a seemingly endless supply of passive-aggressive bylaws, each one more infuriating than the last. She took her place at the front of the room, a tiny, bespectacled tyrant surveying her domain. The meeting began with the usual parade of petty grievances. Mrs. Gable complained about the excessive barking of Mr. Johnson's Chihuahua. Apparently, it exceeded the HOA-approved decibel level for small-breed canine vocalizations. Mr. Henderson, ironically, was called out for the aforementioned excessively whimsical gnome collection in his front yard. Each complaint was met with Margaret's impassive stare and a scratch of her pen on that infernal clipboard. The tension ratcheted up another notch. I could feel the collective blood pressure of the room rising. We were all waiting for the main event, the real reason we'd been summoned. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat, the sound amplified by the cheap microphone. "Now," she said, her voice a thin, reedy rasp, "we come to the matter of swimming pools." A hush fell over the room. "After careful consideration," she continued, her eyes sweeping over us like a prison warden, "the board has determined that swimming pools are detrimental to the overall aesthetic and property values of Sunridge Estates." Detrimental? I almost choked on my lukewarm, bitter coffee. "Furthermore," she droned on, "pools are breeding grounds for unsavory elements. They attract teenagers who, I might add, have been observed consuming carbonated beverages within a 5-mile radius of my property." The horror in her voice was almost comical. Almost. "Therefore," she announced, delivering the final blow with the cold precision of a guillotine, "effective immediately, all private swimming pools within Sunridge Estates are to be banned, removed, or filled in." The room erupted like a volcano of repressed suburban rage. Mr. Henderson, normally a mild-mannered accountant, looked like he was about to spontaneously combust, his face turning a shade of purple I didn't know was humanly possible. Mrs. Gable, despite her Chihuahua concerns, shrieked in protest. A chorus of "What? And you can't do that!" filled the air. My own reaction was a slow, creeping horror. My pool gone, my sanctuary, my escape from the soul-crushing monotony of lawn care and HOA meetings over my dead, chlorine-soaked body. The initial shock gave way to a simmering, white-hot anger. This wasn't just about a pool. This was about principle. This was about freedom. This was about... Well, mostly it was about my pool, but still, this was war. The next day found me in a state of profound, aquatic-themed despair. I wandered around my backyard, a mournful ghost haunting the scene of my soon-to-be-lost paradise. The pool, once a shimmering oasis, now seemed like a condemned prisoner, awaiting its execution. I stared at the crystal-clear water, picturing it drained, filled with dirt, a sad, barren wasteland. I considered the usual avenues of protest. Petitions? Strongly worded letters? Maybe I could chain myself to the diving board in a dramatic public display of pool-related grief. I could fight this. I could rally the troops. I could become the William Wallace of water features. But honestly, I'm exhausted. Fighting Margaret is like wrestling a badger. You might win, but you're definitely going to get scratched, bitten, and probably end up covered in something unpleasant. The thought of another HOA meeting, another round of bureaucratic warfare, filled me with a bone-deep weariness. Then I saw it. A single rogue sprinkler head sputtering and leaking, spraying a steady stream of water onto a patch of grass near the back fence. It had been broken for weeks, a minor annoyance I'd been meaning to fix. But now it was something else. A seed of an idea, mischievous and slightly unhinged, began to sprout in my mind. Wait a minute. If they hate pools so much, what if I didn't have a pool? What if I had something else? A slow, sly grin crept across my face. This could be interesting. Very interesting indeed. That evening, armed with a highlighter, a large glass of iced tea, because hydration is important even when plotting revenge, and a copy of the Sunridge Estates Homeowners Association bylaws, a document thicker and more convoluted than the tax code, I began my research. I flipped through pages filled with regulations about fence heights, acceptable shrubbery, and the proper placement of garden gnomes, still stinging from that one. Okay, no swimming pools. Section 4, paragraph B, subsection 3. Pretty clear on that one, damn it. No artificial bodies of water designed for recreational purposes. That's a bit broader. But what constitutes designed for recreational purposes? And what about, wait for it, naturally occurring seasonal wetlands? Nothing. Absolutely nothing about naturally occurring seasonal wetlands. Interesting. Very interesting indeed, I muttered to myself, a giddy excitement bubbling up inside me. The highlighter danced across the page, marking potential loopholes and areas of strategic ambiguity. A plan, audacious and wonderfully absurd, began to take shape in my mind. I pictured Margaret's face, contorted in apoplectic rage, as she surveyed my creation. I envisioned the HOA board meetings, consumed by endless debates about the definition of wetland. I saw myself, a champion of passive-aggressive resistance, lounging by my naturally occurring water feature, sipping a beverage of questionable legality. The glorious chaos of it all. A wide, slightly manic grin spread across my face. This was going to be epic. "Margaret St. Clair, you want a war? You've got one. Prepare to meet your watery doom." Operation Accidental. Flooding commenced the next morning. My strategy was one of calculated incompetence. I started with the broken sprinkler, the one I'd conveniently forgotten to fix for weeks. I gave it a theatrical examination, scratching my head and muttering about faulty O-rings and water pressure anomalies. I then proceeded to attempt a repair, ensuring that it continued to leak, but now with a slightly more forceful spray. Next, I strategically positioned a series of tarps across the lower end of my yard, ostensibly to protect some non-existent construction materials. Just keeping things dry, in case of unexpected downpours, I'd explain to anyone who asked, feigning innocence. The tarps, of course, were angled to collect rainwater and channel it towards the designated lake area. Finally, there was the garden hose. One evening, under the cloak of darkness and a healthy dose of self-doubt, I accidentally left it running. "Oh dear," I said to myself, loud enough for any potential eavesdroppers. "I must have forgotten to turn it off. Silly me." I'm not exactly a master engineer. My DIY skills are more Pinterest fail than Bob Vila, but I figured how hard could it be to flood a yard? Turns out harder than it looks. My first attempt resulted in more of a soggy patch than a majestic lake. The grass was definitely greener, and there were a few promising puddles, but it was hardly the awe-inspiring body of water I'd envisioned. My efforts, however, did not go unnoticed. Mrs. Higgins, my next-door neighbor, a woman with a penchant for bird-watching and an uncanny ability to detect any deviation from suburban normalcy, began eyeing my activities with suspicion. She'd peer over the fence, her binoculars trained not on the avian wildlife, but on my increasingly damp backyard. "Everything all right over there, dear?" she'd call out, her voice dripping with a mixture of concern and thinly veiled accusation. "Just admiring the, natural drainage patterns," I'd reply, trying to sound convincingly nonchalant. The game was on. My initial subtle flooding attempts were, to put it mildly, underwhelming. The soggy patch persisted, but it was stubbornly refusing to evolve into anything resembling a lake. I needed more firepower. I needed a pump. So I drove to the local rental center, trying to project an air of casual competence. "Just need a little pump," I told the burly guy behind the counter, "for some landscaping." He raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced, and led me to a monstrous contraption that looked like it belonged on a construction site, not in my suburban backyard. It was a heavy-duty, gas-powered, industrial-strength water pump, painted a garish shade of orange. Getting it home was a challenge in itself. It barely fit in my minivan, and I'm pretty sure I scraped the paint off my neighbor's mailbox in the process. Once I'd wrestled it into my backyard, the real fun began. This thing looked like it belonged on a construction site, not in my suburban backyard. It roared like a jet engine and spewed water with the force of a fire hose. I'm pretty sure I accidentally created a small tsunami in my neighbor's flower bed. The instructions, a single, oil-stained page, were written in a language I could only assume was ancient Sumerian. After several false starts, a near-deafening series of backfires, and a liberal application of curse words, I finally managed to get the beast running. Water gushed forth with terrifying force, transforming my soggy patch into a rapidly expanding puddle. I may have overdone it slightly. The torrent of water overflowed the carefully placed tarps, creating a small river that flowed directly into Mrs. Higgins' meticulously manicured petunia patch. "What in tarnation is going on over there?" she shrieked, appearing at the fence, her face a mask of floral fury. "Just, testing the irrigation system," I yelled back, desperately trying to wrestle the pump's throttle into submission. New, eco-friendly design, very efficient." Mrs. Higgins did not look convinced. She narrowed her eyes, her gaze fixed on the miniature Niagara Falls cascading into her prized petunias. "It looks like you're trying to flood the entire neighborhood," she accused. "Nonsense," I replied, with a nervous laugh that sounded suspiciously like a strangled hiccup. "Just a little spring cleaning." I finally managed to shut off the pump, leaving a trail of watery destruction in my wake. This was going to be harder than I thought. The aftermath of the great pump incident of '23 was impressive. My backyard was no longer a soggy patch. It was a bona fide body of water. Granted, it was a muddy, uneven, and somewhat alarming body of water, but a body of water nonetheless. Now came the fun part: transforming this accidental flood zone into a believable seasonal lake. I started with the aesthetics. I ordered a batch of artificial lily pads online. Guaranteed to float, the website promised, with a suspicious lack of emphasis on look realistic. I scattered them across the surface, trying to achieve a natural, Monet-esque effect. Next came the rocks. I hauled several large, jagged stones from a nearby construction site, with permission, of course, mostly, arranging them around the perimeter to create a natural shoreline. Then there was the dock. My carpentry skills are, shall we say, rudimentary. I managed to cobble together a small, rickety wooden platform, using some salvaged lumber and a lot of hope. It leaned precariously to one side, and I'm pretty sure one of the support posts was actually an old broom handle, but it technically qualified as a dock. Okay, it's not exactly Lake Tahoe, but it's starting to look vaguely lake-like. A slightly swampy, suspiciously rectangular lake, but a lake nonetheless, I thought, surveying my handiwork. To complete the illusion, I decided I needed some aquatic life. I ordered a dozen koi fish online, picturing them gracefully gliding through the clear, pristine waters of my lake. The reality, however, was somewhat different. The water was still murky. The lily pads kept flipping upside down, and the koi, upon arrival, looked distinctly unimpressed with their new surroundings. I spent the next few days frantically researching koi care, adding water treatments, and praying that they wouldn't all float to the surface belly up. It was a steep learning curve, and I'm pretty sure I aged a decade in the process. One morning, I awoke to a sound I hadn't expected: quacking. I peered out my window, and there they were. A family of ducks, a mother and 5 fluffy ducklings, paddling serenely across my lake. They'd arrived uninvited, unannounced, and seemingly undeterred by the questionable water quality and suspiciously rectangular shape of their new home. I was both delighted and slightly bewildered. I hadn't planned for ducks, but they certainly added a touch of authenticity to my faux wetland. It was as if nature itself was conspiring with me against the HOA. This, I decided, was the final touch. It was time to make it official. I grabbed a piece of scrap wood, some leftover paint from my ill-fated attempt to repaint the garden shed, a project that ended with more paint on me than on the shed, and fashioned a sign. "Welcome to Lake Serenity, a natural seasonal wetland," I wrote, in my best attempt at rustic handwriting. I wrote it in my best rustic handwriting, which, let's be honest, looks like a 5-year-old did it with a crayon. But hey, it gets the message across. I hammered the sign into the ground near the edge of the lake, next to the slightly listing dock. I stepped back, surveying my creation. The ducks quacked approvingly, or maybe they were just hungry. The koi, miraculously, were still alive. The water was, well, it was still water. And the sign, in all its crooked, hand-painted glory, proclaimed my triumph to the world. This is it. This is my masterpiece, my act of glorious watery defiance. Let the games begin, I thought, a surge of defiant glee coursing through me. Margaret St. Clair, prepare yourself. Lake Serenity is open for business. The arrival of Margaret St. Clair and her HOA entourage was heralded by the rhythmic tapping of clipboards against thighs, the war drums of suburban conformity. They marched across my lawn, a phalanx of disapproval, their faces etched with a mixture of outrage and disbelief. Margaret, of course, led the charge, her expression a thundercloud of tightly pursed lips and narrowed eyes. Behind her trailed Mr. Henderson, of gnome infamy, looking distinctly uncomfortable, and Mrs. Gable, her gaze darting nervously between the lake and her meticulously manicured fingernails. "What?" Margaret began, her voice dripping with icy disdain. "Is this?" She gestured towards Lake Serenity with a trembling hand, as if pointing at a particularly offensive pile of refuse. "This," I replied, with a calm I certainly didn't feel, "is Lake Serenity." I gestured towards my hand-painted sign. Margaret's eyes followed my hand, her expression morphing from disbelief to apoplectic rage. "This is preposterous!" she sputtered, her voice rising an octave. "This is clearly a pool disguised as a swamp. Swamp, lady, I've got koi fish." This is practically a Zen garden, I thought, fighting back a surge of indignant amusement. "I assure you, Margaret," I said, maintaining my serene facade, "this is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's a seasonal lake. It formed due to unusual weather patterns. And, you know, the natural contours of the land. It's all very ecological." I beamed at her, radiating an aura of innocent helpfulness. Margaret looked like she was about to explode. "Ecological?" she shrieked. "You flooded your backyard. You deliberately violated the HOA bylaws." "I did no such thing," I protested, feigning innocence. "This is a natural wetland. It's habitat for ducks." I pointed towards the family of ducks, who were, at that very moment, paddling serenely across the murky water, seemingly oblivious to the unfolding drama. "This is not over," Margaret hissed, her face a mask of furious determination. "We will be taking legal action. You will hear from our lawyers." She spun on her heel, her clipboard held aloft like a weapon, and stormed off, her entourage trailing behind her like a flock of bewildered, disapproving geese. The air crackled with the unspoken promise of a battle to come. I smiled. Let the legal games begin. The HOA's next line of attack arrived in the form of Professor Stanley Piffle, Margaret St. Clair's cousin, and, according to her, a renowned geologist. Professor Piffle, the title was self-bestowed, I suspected, looked less like a scientist and more like a retired accountant who'd spent a little too much time in the sun. He was a portly man with a wispy comb-over, a stained Hawaiian shirt, and a magnifying glass that he held with an air of profound importance. He spent the next hour poking around Lake Serenity, making pronouncements that were increasingly absurd. He tapped rocks with his magnifying glass, sniffed the air with exaggerated sniffs, and peered intently at the muddy water as if expecting it to reveal the secrets of the universe. Yes, he declared, pointing to a patch of particularly soggy grass, a clear indication of, subaquatic tectonic activity? Tectonic activity? I asked, raising an eyebrow. In my backyard? Precisely, he said, puffing out his chest. This area is clearly a geological anomaly. A miniature fault line, perhaps? A fault line? I repeated, struggling to keep a straight face. That's causing seasonal flooding? Indeed, he said, nodding sagely. The, hydrostatic pressure is fluctuating due to, lunar tides. Lunar tides affecting a puddle in my backyard? This guy's making it up as he goes along, I thought, barely suppressing a chuckle. Fascinating, I said with mock seriousness. So you're saying this lake is entirely natural? Well, he stammered, finally cornered. The, evidence suggests a degree of human influence, but the underlying geological formations are undoubtedly present. In other words, he had absolutely no proof that I'd done anything. He concluded with a final dramatic flourish of his magnifying glass that Lake Serenity was most likely man-made, but he couldn't definitively say how. Margaret, who'd been watching the entire performance with a hopeful expression, deflated like a punctured balloon. Just as Margaret was about to launch into another tirade, a new element entered the fray. A small bus, adorned with pictures of various birds, pulled up to the curb. Out poured a flock of, well, bird watchers. The Sunridge Estates Birdwatching Society, it turned out, had heard rumors of a newly formed wetland habitat in the area, and they'd come to investigate. They were an enthusiastic and slightly eccentric bunch, clad in khaki vests, binoculars dangling from their necks, and wide-brimmed hats that offered protection from both the sun and, I suspected, any potential bird droppings. They immediately descended upon Lake Serenity, their eyes wide with excitement. "Magnificent!" exclaimed a woman with a bright purple vest and a pair of binoculars that looked powerful enough to spot a sparrow on the moon. A perfect example of a thriving, newly formed wetland ecosystem. "Look!" cried a man with a bushy beard and a notebook, pointing towards the ducks. "Mallards! And are those coots? Remarkable!" They began identifying various bird species, some of which I hadn't even noticed, with an almost religious fervor. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about migratory patterns, nesting habits, and the importance of preserving this precious natural resource. They had, unknowingly, become my most valuable allies. Margaret, seeing her carefully constructed case crumbling before her eyes, attempted to intervene. "Excuse me," she said, her voice shrill and strained. "This is private property, and this is not a wetland. It's a drainage issue." The birdwatchers ignored her. They were too busy marveling at the biodiversity of my muddy puddle. "We must protect this habitat," declared the woman with the purple vest. "This is a vital stopover point for migrating birds." "Indeed," agreed the man with the bushy beard. "We must ensure its long-term preservation." Margaret tried again, her voice rising in desperation. But it's a pool. He flooded it." The birdwatchers, however, were unfazed. They were armed with binoculars, field guides, and an unwavering belief in the sanctity of any body of water that attracted a feathered creature. Margaret, outnumbered and out-enthused, was utterly defeated. The birdwatching cavalry had arrived, and Lake Serenity was safe. For now. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get any more absurd, it did. I was surveying my lake, admiring the way the sunlight glinted off the slightly less murky than before water, when I saw it. A small, dark shape, moving slowly along the bottom. It was a turtle. Not just any turtle, though. This one was different. He was a grumpy-looking little guy, no bigger than my hand, with a dark, moss-covered shell and a perpetually frowning expression. He was a grumpy-looking little guy, but he was my grumpy-looking little guy. And he was about to become my legal savior. I later learned he was a Blandings turtle, a species classified as endangered in our state. How he ended up in my backyard lake was a mystery, a stroke of sheer dumb luck, a gift from the gods of suburban warfare. The birdwatchers, who were still meticulously documenting every feathered creature within a 5-mile radius, spotted him almost immediately. A collective gasp went up. "A Blandings turtle!" cried the woman in the purple vest, her voice trembling with excitement. Incredible! This is a truly remarkable discovery." The man with the bushy beard fumbled for his notebook, his hands shaking. This changes everything. This is now a protected habitat. We must alert the authorities." The other birdwatchers swarmed around the lake, snapping pictures, taking notes, and generally behaving as if they'd just discovered a new species of dinosaur. The turtle, seemingly unfazed by the commotion, continued his slow, deliberate exploration of his new domain. Margaret, who had been watching the scene unfold with a growing sense of dread, finally snapped. Her face was a mask of utter defeat. She knew she was beaten. She couldn't touch my lake now. Not without facing the wrath of not only the birdwatchers, but also a host of state and federal environmental protection agencies. The endangered turtle, my grumpy-looking little savior, had delivered the final, crushing blow. She turned and walked away, her shoulders slumped, her clipboard dragging on the ground. The battle was over. And I, thanks to a strategically flooded backyard and a miraculously appearing turtle, had won. The following weeks were a blur of legal skirmishes and increasingly desperate maneuvers by the HOA. They tried everything. They sent me threatening letters filled with legalese, citing obscure bylaws and threatening astronomical fines. I countered with a carefully worded letter from my friend Dave, a lawyer who specialized in environmental law and who, conveniently, found the whole situation hilarious. He'd offered his services pro bono, fueled by a combination of amusement and a deep-seated hatred of homeowners associations. They tried to get a court order to drain the lake, claiming it was a public health hazard and a breeding ground for mosquitoes. I presented evidence from the birdwatchers, who testified to the ecological importance of the wetland and the thriving, and surprisingly mosquito-free, ecosystem it supported. They even tried to argue that the turtle wasn't really endangered, claiming it was a common painted turtle that I'd somehow planted in the lake. Dave produced documentation proving the turtle's endangered status, complete with a photo of the grumpy little guy wearing a tiny, numbered tag. It's like watching a chess match where one side only has pawns, and the other side has a queen, a rook, and a surprisingly effective bishop in the form of a grumpy turtle, I thought, watching their efforts crumble one by one. Each attempt was met with a swift, decisive counterattack, leaving them flailing and frustrated. The final, glorious nail in the HOA's coffin came from an unexpected source: the city. Seeing the lake as a PR opportunity. Local man creates thriving wetland ecosystem in backyard. And recognizing the potential boost to local wildlife, the City Council voted unanimously to officially designate my backyard as Lake Serenity, a recognized local wetland. The irony was exquisite. The HOA, the very organization that had tried to destroy my lake, was now legally obligated to protect and maintain it. They were required to put up signs acknowledging its protected status, to organize annual cleanup events, and to ensure that no construction or activity within a certain radius would threaten the delicate ecological balance of Lake Serenity. The official designation ceremony was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive triumph. I stood on my rickety dock, surrounded by beaming city officials, enthusiastic birdwatchers, and a surprisingly large crowd of curious onlookers. Margaret St. Clair was forced to attend, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. She had to stand there, clutching her clipboard like a life raft in a sea of humiliation, while the mayor praised my environmental stewardship and presented me with a certificate, which, I noted with amusement, featured a rather unflattering drawing of a Blandings turtle. The forced smile she plastered on her face was a thing of beauty, a testament to the crushing weight of defeat. The following week, the inevitable happened. Margaret St. Clair resigned from the Sunridge Estates Homeowners Association, citing personal reasons. The news was delivered via a terse, unsigned email, a far cry from her usual verbose and condescending pronouncements. I didn't gloat, publicly at least. Internally, however, I was doing a victory dance. "So long, Margaret," I thought, raising an imaginary glass in her direction. "May your future endeavors be filled with excessively whimsical garden gnomes and perfectly manicured lawns, just not in my neighborhood." The quiet satisfaction was immense. A warm, fuzzy feeling that spread through me like a shot of good whiskey. The tyrant had been overthrown, and all it had taken was a little bit of water and a whole lot of spite. A year later, Lake Serenity was thriving. The water had cleared, the lily pads were flourishing, and the koi fish had grown fat and lazy. The ducks had raised several generations of ducklings, and the birdwatchers were regular visitors, their binoculars trained on the diverse array of avian life that now called my backyard home. People actually kayaked on my lake. Kayaked. The HOA, under new, much more lenient leadership, was forced to send out monthly newsletters celebrating the natural beauty of Lake Serenity and reminding residents of their responsibility to preserve our precious local wetland. They even organized guided tours. I sat on my dock, now reinforced and slightly less rickety, sipping a cold beer and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Mrs. Higgins, my once suspicious neighbor, was now a regular visitor, bringing me homemade cookies and regaling me with stories of the various birds she'd spotted. We shared a toast. "To Lake Serenity," she said, a twinkle in her eye. "To seasonal lakes and infinite loopholes," I replied, raising my glass. Who knew that spite, a broken sprinkler, and a surprisingly resilient turtle could bring so much joy? I guess sometimes you just gotta flood your backyard to find paradise.